Okay, so I guess we'll get started. Hi everyone, thank you for joining this webinar. I hope that everyone can hear us okay. So this is the first Access Open Minds external webinar, so it's a very exciting time for us and we're very happy to be sharing some of our expertise with you. And we actually have panelists today who are calling in from 4 different time zones. So just goes to show how widespread our network is. And I'm really happy that you can all hear from them today. So I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanaroke Mohawk, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst nations. And I would also like to thank our partners Frame, who are hosting this webinar for us and have really helped us out with the logistics of it. So just some housekeeping rules to start off with. The webinar will start with a roundtable where each of our speakers will be presenting their topic. And then we'll be going into a panel discussion where all of our speakers will be chatting and discussing different challenges to do with peer support, and then we'll finish with a Q&A. So if you do have any questions that come up during the webinar, if you go at the bottom of your screen, you should have a Q&A box, and that is where you're able to submit questions. So the chat today is going to be dedicated to the translation. So please put all your Q&As into that specific box. I also want to introduce Geraldine, who you can't see, but who's on the line, and she's the one doing the live translation for us. At the end of the webinar, you'll also be directed to a quick survey, but I'll talk to you about that more at the end. So just for those who don't know anything about Access Open Minds, we're a pan-Canadian research and evaluation project that's transforming mental health for youth aged 11 to 25 at 15 diverse sites located in 6 provinces and 1 territory in Canada. Access sites are providing local youth with timely, accessible and appropriate care and are generating knowledge on the impact of this service transformation on individual and system outcomes. One of the kind of special things about Access is the diversity of its clinical team. So no team is the same because they're each shaped so that they're appropriate for the needs and realities of the youth that they're serving in the local youth. So with this in mind, many of our sites have integrated peer support workers into their teams, and these individuals are often the first point of contact for you. So today we have 5 amazing speakers from the Access Open Minds network who will be presenting their knowledge and expertise of peer support. But before we start, we would like to know a little bit more about you. So I am now going to be launching a poll. So just to see where you're from and what your understanding is of peer support before this webinar. So I'll give you a few minutes to answer that. Okay, so it looks like our audience is as spread out as our speakers. I'm sorry that I couldn't list all of the regions individually. It's just that I'm limited in the number of answers that I can offer. So we have people from Alberta, Ontario, Quebec, Atlantic Canada. So welcome to everyone. It looks like a lot of you are in leadership and governance roles, as well as peer supporters and researchers. So that's great that we have peer supporters on the line and people who also want to learn more about peer support. And it looks like most of you have a good understanding of peer support, so that's great, and we're hoping that today you will learn even more. So thanks for everyone who completed that poll. Okay, so, oh sorry, I didn't realize you couldn't see the results. So here are the results for everyone who's interested. So now we'll start with our first speaker, who is Gina Dimitropoulos, who is going to talk about all things peer support research. Gina is an assistant professor with the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Calgary, and she primarily conducts research on peer support interventions in the area of youth mental health. So I will now share her PowerPoint. Sorry about this, the logistics. Okay, so everyone should be able to see the PowerPoint, and I'll give it over to Gina.
Thank you very much, Chloe, and I really, it's a real privilege to be on this webinar and to have the opportunity to present alongside the panelists today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that I'm doing, but if we move over to the second slide, what I have planned for the next 10 minutes is to talk a little bit about what is peer support, and then to review some of the empirical evidence and best practices on peer support. And if I have time, I'd like to talk a little bit about a study that we are currently conducting here in Alberta, focused on the role of family peer support in the context of pediatric emergency departments. I don't know that I'll get to the third aim, but regardless, I have all of the slides embedded so people can look at what are some of our preliminary findings are. So if we move over to the next slide, in my attempts to find a really good definition of peer support, it struck me that there's peer support is defined quite widely in the literature, from terms used such as peer specialist, peer mentor, consumer provider, and peer navigator. And so some of the very definitions of or terms that are used to ascribe what is a peer support worker can create some confusion. But regardless of the definition that's used, I think what's really important to note is that it really refers to individuals with lived experience who have either recovered or are recovering or have had some experience with mental health services who provide support to others with similar experiences. And I found this really powerful quote, if you will, that I think to me encapsulates what peer support really means. And this was in an article that I read last night by Gillard. It's an editorial piece. But I'll just read this. So peer support is what we do when we recognize our shared experiences of disadvantage and distress and make an interpersonal connection on that basis and come together to support and learn from each other. So if we move over to the next slide. Through experiential knowledge sharing, peer support workers convey understanding, compassion, acceptance, and I think one of the best gifts or roles that peer support workers take on is that they really are a witness to people's struggles, and they walk alongside them as they find their own journey or path to healing and recovery. And I wanted to highlight some of the main tasks and responsibilities and roles undertaken by peer support workers across various contexts. And they include some of the following. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but they provide emotional, informational, instrumental, and navigational support. and they provide hope to people with lived experience that recovery is possible. I think we could probably do a whole other webinar on just how we conceptualize recovery, because it means different things to different people. And what I really want to emphasize that I think one of the things that one of the I guess major advantages or benefits of peer support is that it demonstrates that one can live a meaningful and productive and good life with a mental health issue, because recovery isn't always possible, and that we want to be cautious that we're not implying that peer support workers can only provide help and support to others when they are in recovery, and I used quotes. Another important task, if you will, is that peer support workers are just by who they are and how they bring themselves to their relationships with other peers who have lived experiences, that they help to challenge internalized and structural stigma. And so we'll move on to the next slide. So peer support is delivered in a multitude of contexts, including but not limited to some of the following. They're offered in peer-led self-help groups, peer-operated organizations, and we have a number of amazing programs that are peer-operated across Canada, like Stella's House in Toronto and some of the work the Founder's doing in BC. We also find peer support workers in clubhouses or walk-in centers, in employment organizations, social services, and even child protection services are now really engaging young people who have aged out of care to provide mentorship and support to people who are living in foster care or involved in child protection. We also find peer support workers in educational systems, including secondary and post-secondary schools. And there's been a proliferation of peer support online, in online groups. And we also know that peer support has more recently, I would say in the last decade, we're really seeing, again, an increase in the integration of peer support workers across the continuum of mental health services, starting with outpatient mental health services to residential treatments. And often peer support is delivered as an adjunct or complement to existing mental health services, or it's delivered as a standalone intervention. Okay, so next slide. So one of the questions that I was asked to speak to is, and I could probably spend the rest of the 2 hours speaking about the advantages of peer support to mental health systems. And I've only listed a few that I really I think are important to highlight. I think through their work with peer support workers, service providers learn about that recovery is possible. And in contrast to the medical model or biopsychosocial models that are often employed in traditional mental health services, mental health providers in their work with peer support workers learn that there are different ways of working with people. There are different approaches that can be used, such as recovery-oriented models, strengths-based approaches. So I think that by integrating more peer support workers and conventional mental health systems, we've been able to really be much more inclusive in looking at different models of care. Another advantage is that individuals who have experienced trauma or negative experiences with service providers or organizations, they may find that they're able to better build a meaningful connection with peer support workers who have similar shared experiences. People seeking help for their mental health issues are more likely to disclose in the context of an egalitarian relationship with a peer support worker than they might be with a service provider where there's a clear hierarchy. And then a couple more advantages. Through the use of a non-directive and strengths-based approach, peers can help clients to really identify and develop their own goals. And sometimes the goals that individuals develop may not always be in direct alignment with what providers want. So being able to work with someone who's really just focused on being with people where they're at is a real, I think, advantage to mental health systems. Peer support workers help raise awareness of the importance of process and not just outcomes. And mental health systems are often designed to really focus on decreasing symptoms, rehabilitation, and peer support workers really just focus on the here and now and on process. Another advantage is they help mediate between clients and teams, and they help advocate with and for clients to ensure that their voice is being heard. Okay, and the next slide. So I spent the last little while doing a massive literature review on empirical evidence to support the effectiveness of peer support. And to the best of my knowledge, there are RCTs or meta-analysis really have resulted in inconclusive or mixed findings about the effectiveness of peer support when compared to treatment as usual on a variety of different critical outcomes. And I'd like to say a few things about this because I think it's really important to emphasize that these inconclusive findings may have more to do with the methodologies that are being used and maybe even some of the challenges in the way that these treatment studies are designed. That often there's inconsistent definitions of peer support, there's very little supervision and training offered to peer support workers. In the context of the randomized controlled trials that are conducted, we've got really small sample sizes that make it difficult to determine if there are any statistically significant differences. And the clinical outcomes that are often used in randomized controlled trials are not the ones that are actually meaningful to people with lived experience, peer support workers and recipients of peer support. So although there isn't a lot of evidence to support the efficacy of peer support, I would argue that we actually need to do more research and that we need to ask peer support workers and recipients of peer support what they think we should be measuring. And in fact, there was a study that was done recently by Fortuna and 2019 that demonstrated that peer support workers actually believe that we should be measuring outcomes such as loneliness or social isolation or empowerment or self-efficacy when we're looking at the effectiveness of peer interventions rather than the outcomes that are often used in RCTs, which is looking at improvements in symptoms. Okay, so next slide. But there is some preliminary evidence that I really want to highlight that's important, again, for us to have at the forefront of our mind when we're thinking about peer support. There's some research to show that it contributes to increased empowerment and decreased stigma. It's been linked to enhanced social support and improvements in quality of life. And a meta-synthesis of qualitative and mixed method studies found that peer support workers are positive role models. They easily build rapport and connections with peers, and they again challenge stigma. And the peer support staff have been shown to help with care coordination for frequent users of adult emergency departments. And when peer support is included as an adjunct to clinical interventions, they can reduce the use of acute care services, including emergency departments. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the benefits of peer support, and there is lots of research to demonstrate that peer support is beneficial to the person who is providing peer support, to the recipients of peer support, and there's lots of advantages to organizations. So I've talked already a lot about the advantages of peer support to people with lived experience. But I want to just emphasize for those who are providing peer support that they actually experience increased personal empowerment. They find new meaning and purpose in their lives. They also experience increased self-efficacy, self-esteem, and self-confidence. And there's lots of advantages to having peer support workers in organizations and in workplace environments. They really do help kind of shift people's perspectives about how we view mental health and mental illnesses. They challenge stigma. They introduce a more holistic approach to care. And they also, again, make sure that people's with lived experiences, that their voice is paramount in all of the treatment decisions that we make. They connect better with clients who may not necessarily feel safe or accepted in traditional mental health systems that are hierarchical in nature. Okay, and next slide. There are a number of challenges and pitfalls that I just want to highlight that have come out of my own work in the area of peer support and also what I reviewed in the literature. There's some inadequate or inconsistent training of peer support workers to prepare them for the integration into conventional mental health services. The flip side is that by providing more extensive training and credentialing and regulation of peer support workers, there is a potential that we might threaten and undermine the authenticity and genuineness of peer support workers and how they relate to clients. So there's this real tension between more training But the more training we provide, that it can really lead to also us having an impact on what people bring, which is their lived experience and then just being really genuine. I'm probably almost running out of my time, so I'm going to move quickly. There's also sometimes a lack of role clarity and role ambiguity of peer support workers, which may lead them to becoming co-opted into being mini clinicians or taking on responsibilities that are really not within the scope of their practice. Conventional traditional mental health services tend to be very risk averse, and that could lead to, again, the overregulation or placing restrictions on what peer support workers can actually do and what they can deliver, which it can be problematic. And I do think that, to me, the most important pitfall or challenge is that we need to do more to prepare organizations to make sure that they have the readiness they need to be able to integrate peer support workers, because I think it's problematic when we are trying to embed a peer support workers in organizations that tend to be hierarchical, very outcome focused. There's an emphasis on reductions of symptoms rather than, people's right to self-determination, collaboration, egalitarian relationships, and where change can happen in multiple domains. So I don't know, Chloe, do I have a bit more time or am I out of time at this stage?
I'm very, very sorry, but you're out of time.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Gina.
You're welcome.
So we were meant to, oh, Karen, you're on the line. I was worried we'd lost you there. So thank you very much, Gina. I will stop sharing the slides now. There we go. So our next speaker is Karen Pinkowski, who will be talking about family peer support. Karen is a member at large of the Access Open Minds National Family and Carers Council. Her day job is a student services advisor at the University of Alberta, with a side gig as a student at the University of Calgary in the Bachelor of Social Work program. Karen lives in Edmonton with her partner and 2 adult children, along with a super duo of rescue animals, dog Pippin and cat Oscar. So over to you, Karen.
Thanks, Chloe, and thanks for having me at the webinar. I'm really happy to be here. I also want to say thank you to the Access Open Minds at the University of Alberta for hosting me in their space today, so shout out to them. And just before I get started, I want to ground myself and acknowledge that I'm seated on Treaty 6 territory here in Edmonton. So as Chloe said, I'm a member at large of the for the Access Open Minds Family and Carers Council, and I'm a mom of 2 adult children. Mental health issues is a thread that is woven throughout the fabric of our family in the form of OCD, type 2 bipolar, and suicidal ideation. And so I'm going to talk today about my experience in supporting my son through his mental health journey. We were expecting that he would present at some point with mental health issues. He was living at home when he was around 18-ish, and we were able to observe his behavior on a daily basis. And so it really wasn't a surprise when he started to present with symptoms of OCD and type 2 bipolar. What we weren't prepared for was the manifestation. And when he finally sat down and told us what he'd been doing and going through, honestly, my first feeling was terror. When I remember that conversation well, when we sat down and he revealed it all, I literally had a flight response and I fled from the room. And I was terrified. I was going to lose my son and I didn't know what to do. So we started building the support structures around him. And to help him to climb out of this spiral that he found himself in. And so we connected him with resources and got him a good counselor that he liked and connected to. But there, very quickly, we started seeing the barriers coming up. And so the counselor, it was difficult to get to, took Adam forever to get to his appointments. And then he went away for 2 months. So that connection was broken. He also at one point had a very unfortunate referral to a psychiatrist that went very badly, and he didn't go back. after that. So here we were with no counselor, no psychiatrist. So none of the things that we are told as parents are necessary for effective mental health treatment. And we were left with a prescription from our family doctor, who admittedly didn't know much about mental health treatment. So where do you go? What do you do when you cannot easily access treatment and support when you need it and are ready? And so the only way I can really describe how I was feeling at that point was helpless. And I hoped we could just wait it out, hold on until we can, that our support was going to be enough for our son. And as you all know, like, mental health issues bring with it stigma, which can lead to isolation. And I felt very, very alone. And I was afraid that if I showed myself to be vulnerable, or showed myself that I couldn't look after my son, that would be an indictment on my parenting skills. As a mom, you're not supposed to be vulnerable. You're not supposed to show weakness. But the antidote of stigma is connection. And I needed support. And so this is where peer support comes in, and is invaluable. You look for the keepers of wisdom in your community, and it's parents and carers who've been through it. They are experts in navigating the mental health system, know where all the gaps and the pitfalls are, and they've developed strategies to be able to support their youth effectively until formal help is accessible. And so one of the first things I did was seek support. And I called someone I knew at the University of Alberta. This was the cheapest and easiest resource available to me. She was in student support, and she had lived experience. And she took the time to listen to me. And she was that peer support person for me. It grounded me. It gave me the foundation I needed to be able to help my son. She also gave me some really good practical strategies, which really helped me help my son. So I'm forever grateful for her being there for me at that time. And this was also around the time that many suicides were being reported across the country in post-secondary institutions. And we had, at the U of A, we had our counseling and clinical services had months-long waiting lists. They were turning huge amount of students away daily. So that really wasn't a resource that we could access easily either. And I could quickly see my son becoming one of those statistics. So a student with mental health issues, unable to assemble the support structures that he needed, and seeing no other way out but suicide because he couldn't conceive of any way for it to end. I needed practical ways to help and support my son that did not involve formal healthcare systems while we were waiting for access. And so one of those strategies that I used was psychoeducation. And I'm a huge, huge proponent of psychoeducation. To quote Maya Angelou, when you know better, you do better. So one of the things that I did was I became a distress line listener. And the distress line taught me how to talk about suicide comfortably. And I also learned how to do suicide intervention. And I didn't really intend at the time that I would need those skills. I would need to use those skills in my own family. But I did, and I continue to do so. So it's one of those things that you hope you never need, but boy, are you glad when you have. And I've seen it firsthand, very personally, just how impactful that can be. It's a life-saving skill to have. And so the next thing is I learned to benefit from the wisdom of others. And I learned through my friends at the Family and Carers Council, for example. I have fantastic peer support now from people who have been there. And they're there for me, even if it's just to listen. And this really helps to normalize what I'm going through. And I know that I am not alone. And it's, back to my social work education. I put my psychoeducation into practice by building my own helping skills. So I learned how to meet people where they're at, to recognize that they are the experts in their own experience, and how to support them in their own journey as they go through their own issues. And I can share my experience for the benefit of others. Self-care is also really, really important. I put the oxygen mask on myself first, I can't help others if I'm not physically, mentally, and emotionally healthy. So now putting it all into practice, what does that look like? So for me, for everyone, family is a natural resource that we can take advantage of. And so just as my son's main support is us, we're his main support as his family, my family is my main support, and that includes my son. We are willing partners in both his and our own journeys for wellness. And we continually build to strengthen our capacity as a family. So with our son, we also helped him to build his coping skills. And so knowing what he was up against allowed him to be positive about his mental health issues and better manage his OCD and bipolar. We support him with putting together and articulating his own comprehensive self-care management plan. We recognize and validate what he feels is best for him. And our support for him, or what that plan for him looks like, changes over time. And it involves medication sometimes it doesn't, sometimes he just doesn't want to take it, which is fine. We support him either way. It's whatever he feels is best for him. And I just want to go back. So one of my side volunteer jobs is I volunteer at a drop-in center for high-risk youth. And so with those youth, I see what it looks like when there is no family involvement and when they have little or no support to navigate those services. And we see what it's like, which is homelessness, drug addiction, street involvement. You can see by its absence just how important family is. So back to the Access Open Minds Family and Carers Council, what we do there is we engage families in their own community context so that they can support their youth. Family and carer support is essential for the implementation and continuity of care for well-being and recovery of youth with mental health issues. And we firmly believe that good mental health begins with the family, and that unifying and supporting families increases positive outcomes for youth. There is lots and lots and lots of evidence to say that supported families increases those positive outcomes for youth. And finally, on my last note, when families and carers are adequately supported, everyone benefits. And that's what we do at with the Family and Carers Council. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karen. So now we will move on to our third speaker. So Lee Thomas, who will be speaking from a post-secondary youth lens and who will touch on the philosophical obstacles peers pose. Lee is a speaker, writer, and advocate currently based in Calgary. They have worked with a number of organizations, including Access Open Minds, National Youth Council, FRAME, Peer Support Canada, and the Canadian Mental Health Association. Lee teaches mental health first aid and assist applied suicide intervention skills training and is currently doing a Master of Social Work at U of C. So over to Lee. Sorry, I don't know what I've done. Sorry about that. I'm very sorry. We have lost Lee. I can't see. I'm very sorry. I think we'll then go on to Alicia and come back to Lee. Oh no, Lee is back.
Hi, I'm back.
Sorry, that was completely my fault.
No worries. I was like, oh, got kicked out. All right, I've made my swift exit. I love it.
Well, over to Lee.
Okay, so hi everyone. Glad that all of you could join us. Really looking forward to the conversation. So I had printed out my notes of what I wanted to talk about. and you can see all the scribbles on them because I'm like, oh, I also want to talk about this, and I also want to talk about this. So I'm trying to be really mindful that I have like my time, and I'm gonna try not to go over. But there are like so many different aspects to peer support that I would really, really love to talk about. So a bit about my background: I became really interested in peer support when I was in post-secondary, and kind of similar to Karen's story, but from the child side of things, where I was trying to access services, really, really struggling with it, accessing a lot of peer support online in what I would call non-traditional peer support spaces. So like social media sites and that sort of thing. And then eventually accessing sort of group therapy, sort of peer support through various groups at the university. And then when I graduated, I worked with an organization that worked with a lot of other different universities and colleges and tried to set up peer support programs or enhance their peer support programs that they already had. And it's raised a lot of really interesting things for me. I think the first one is around this idea of, in the haste, I forgot to do my land acknowledgement, which I really do want to do. I think sometimes land acknowledgements, this is kind of my take on it, I think sometimes land acknowledgements are things that white settlers do to like absolve ourselves of guilt. So I just want to throw that out there, that like, I think there's a lot more to being an Indigenous ally than just doing a land acknowledgement. But this is kind of more about my story, so I don't talk a lot about kind of my role as a settler, but I did want to talk about, so I'm currently in Calgary, which is on Treaty 7 territory, which is home to the Blackfoot Confederacy, Tsuut'ina First Nation, and Stoney Nakoda, as well as Métis Nation Region 3. And I think that, you know, as much as land acknowledgement should not be the final step in being an Indigenous ally, I also think that like when you have governments saying, let's not do land acknowledgements anymore, it's really important to remember to do them. So that's so going back now to epistemology, which is probably not a big jump, so epistemology is basically a fancy word for like, how do we know what knowledge is? Like, how do we know what is knowledge versus what is experience versus what is an opinion? How do we know how we validate knowledge? And I think peer support really does challenge the existing ways that we think about epistemology. A lot of the times people don't see lived experience as being a valid form of knowledge unless it's been studied and researched and we can assign a number to it. And then it gets kind of like this stamp on it that says like, yes, this is a valid way of knowing things. And so I think when we really think about the nature of peer support, it's about saying like, you don't need to have a degree, you don't need to be part of the medical system or be part of academia in order to know things in a way that really is valid and really is meaningful for people. And that scares people. Like, I don't think a lot of people in academia or in medical systems would be like, oh, I am afraid of that. I don't think they would articulate it that way, but I think a huge part of the resistance to peer support in a lot of traditional organizations, whether it's clinical, whether it's academic, is this idea that like, if we start treating people with lived experience like they are actually experts, actually fully experts, and not just in their own experience, but experts in this field, that shakes a lot of stuff up. And I think that creates kind of a lot of anxiety for people who work in these fields. And I know that was something that I found in trying to set up peer support programs at various universities, was this kind of like, okay, well, how do we know that this is safe and this is valid and this is good? Because if these people don't have degrees, how do we know that they're legitimate? And so I think this whole idea of epistemology is really, really interesting. Going back to my notes. And along with that epistemology thing, I think it's really interesting how peer support workers are often treated in a way that they like have to represent peer support as a profession in a way that other professions don't. So we'll hear organizations saying like, oh, we tried to set up a peer support thing, didn't work, therefore peer support doesn't work. But we don't hear that with like, oh, you know, we hired a counselor and everyone had a negative experience with them, therefore counseling doesn't work. So it's a kind of a really interesting dynamic that comes out. When we talk about peer support, I think it raises a lot of interesting questions about who is a peer and how do we define a peer. In post-secondary settings, it usually is a peer is someone who is also in post-secondary. I think with mental health organizations, it's often a peer as someone who also has mental health, like lived mental health experience. But is there more to being a peer than that? I think is a really interesting question, especially as I'm going to become a Master of Social Work and a social worker, yay. Is this whole idea of, I'm still a person with lived experience. And so what does that mean for my role as a peer? Am I not allowed to speak from a lived experience perspective because I'm a social worker? Are there contradictions and tensions that exist there? And that's kind of what I've been told by various organizations is, if as a peer supporter and a peer support worker, you can talk about your lived experience, but as a social worker, it is unprofessional of you to do that, which I think is really, really interesting. Especially as someone who's accessed services, and all of my favorite social workers have been ones who've been realistic about their own lived experience. And so I think even as we start to kind of validate and legitimize peer support as a profession, it does create these us versus them tensions. And even this idea of, like peer support work is very difficult work, which it is. And so we need to look at peer support mental health, but why are we not having these conversations in other professions as well? Like it might be difficult to be a peer support worker in a clinical setting, but does that mean that like it's more difficult than being a nurse in a clinical setting or a doctor in a clinical setting? And why are you treating peer support workers have lived experience and everyone else doesn't? It creates these it almost reinforces divides in a lot of ways. And then when, especially in post-secondary settings, if you're working as a peer support worker in post-secondary settings, what do you do with that when you leave post-secondary? I was lucky enough to attend the Peer Support Canada conference in 2016, back when it was called PSAC. And that was a big thing that came out of it, or a big learning that came out of it for me, was this idea of when I am no longer a peer support worker, whether I work in peer support for 2 years or 5 years or 20 years, what then? Because as much as being a peer support worker is great and being a person who's open about having lived experience is great, there are a lot of professional ramifications for that. And that's something I've experienced in the social work program is, when this information is readily available about me on the internet, that I have worked in mental health, that I speak about my own lived experiences, that raises red flags for organizations that are not happy to include people who have lived experience, or not willing to do that epistemological work, or who still believe that people with lived experience are delicate and aren't able to provide good services. And I think we see that a lot in recovery requirements for peer support workers as well, right? Like this idea that you have to be recovered for 2 years before you're able to provide services to others. Because it reinforces the idea that for social workers or doctors or whoever, we just don't have lived experience, I guess, so we don't have that requirement. But that the idea that if you're ill, you're not able to help other people, I think that says a lot to clients. I think it says a lot to the peer support workers, and I think it reinforces a lot of really interesting dynamics. And especially for people like me with chronic health conditions, I am going to be managing a lot of my mental health issues for the rest of my life, and I'm okay with that. That doesn't faze me. I think I can still do really great work. But then how do I know I've reached the 2-year mark of recovery if it's an ongoing thing? I know I'm getting near the end of my time, so I want to talk a little bit about some obstacles specific to post-secondary institutions. I think a big one is liability, and I think it is tied up with these ideas of legitimacy and these ideas of epistemology, where there isn't a great liability, in terms of liability insurance and that sort of thing, there isn't a great liability set up for peer support programs because they're kind of new. So I guess it is legally and practically a big obstacle, but in my experience, it's much more philosophically a big obstacle, because there are institutions and organizations that are doing this and that are doing this very well. So it's not unheard of, it's just unheard of at your institution. And so I think organizations need to get a little bit better about thinking about risk and thinking about, instead of thinking what are the risks of providing this service for our students, starting to think about what are the risks of not providing this service for our students. And, just because I have to put my little plug in for this, I was I don't think that's disconnected from the way that capitalism and our kind of socioeconomic system is set up to work. I think it does create this scarcity. I think it creates fear of taking risks. And I think as peer support workers and as people who are trying to set up peer support programs in these systems, we really have to think about what are we reinforcing? Because I don't want to reinforce the idea that someone's mental health issues are a unique one-off phenomenon to them. With peer support or with post-secondary institutions, we are seeing huge numbers of people who are struggling with their mental health. And it's kind of that thing where, like, if every single fish in a pond is sick, we don't look at like what's wrong with this fish. We look at what's wrong with this pond. And I don't think that we've really started to do that with post-secondary or with a lot of other institutions. And so there's this tension between you want to provide services for these sick fish, but you don't want to make it seem like your sickness is just a one-off biological thing that only has to do with you. My very last thing I'm going to say, because I know my time is up, is that as organizations, whether it's post-secondary institutions, clinical institutions, as they start to open up to peer support is kind of becoming more mainstream and becoming more palatable. And I think we really need to be careful that, like, as peer support becomes more palatable, we're not losing the parts of it that make it meaningful. Really looking forward to your questions, everyone. I only got through part of this, but I have really enjoyed this conversation. Looking forward to the panel talk, the Q&A, and hearing what everyone else has to say. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lee. And yeah, as they said, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box, because right now we don't have any, but I know there are questions out there, so don't hesitate. So now we'll go on to our fourth speaker, who had a bit of difficulty getting on the line, so I'm very pleased that it worked. So Alicia Raimondo will be talking about online peer support. Alicia is a project coordinator for Foundry and is also on the Access Open Minds National Youth Council. Previous to working at Foundry, they worked over 8 years offering peer support online, as well as creating virtual clinic platforms. So over to Alicia.
Hey everyone, it's so awesome to get on the phone today after a bunch of technical difficulties. And I think it's also super awesome to go after Lee and Lee talking about risk, because when you start talking about offering services online, that is the first thing everyone will tell you is that it's really risky. To kind of explain why I'm really interested in offering really good peer support online, I'm going to tell you a bit about my personal story. So I grew up kind of always knowing something was wrong, and that I kind of interacted with the world and had emotions that felt different than how other people described their emotions. And when I finally came to terms with myself that I needed support, there wasn't a lot available to me. There wasn't a lot available in my community. It was much smaller at the time than it is now. And also I didn't really have support of my family to seek services. They're just being the child of new Canadians. They just really didn't understand why someone would seek mental health support. And they've come a long way in that journey since, and I'm very proud to hope to say I've had an influence on them. But at the time, it just wasn't. They weren't going to support me in asking for help. And so I kind of turned to the internet. It was the only thing available for me. I remember even in the case where I was hospitalized for my mental health issues, they put me on wait lists for 7 years to have a service that would meet my needs. And so really, if it wasn't for online communities, both the formal ones and the informal ones, I really wouldn't be here today, because the mental health system just wasn't there for me. And so I really wanted to make that experience of asking for help online and asking for peer support online the best experience possible, because I'm not going to lie to you, there's a lot of the wild west out there online. Sometimes you'll ask for support online and get wonderful, amazing, thoughtful, validating answers, and sometimes you'll get not that. I really just want to make it so that it's a better experience for the young people who ask for services online. So I've helped build a couple different online services. before I moved to Vancouver to work for Foundry, I was working for an organization called Stella's Place and helped them build Beanbag Chat, which is an online peer support app, and have been involved in online peer support in one way, shape, or form for a while. For those of you who are interested, the people who tend to reach out to online support tend to be online peer support tend to be one of three kinds of folks, very generally. It tends to be people living in a lot of rural and remote communities where there's not a lot of services in their actual community, and if there is services there, they just don't trust that their privacy will be respected. That, you know, maybe the therapist in the community is your mom's best friend, and it's just not, even if that person wants to respect your privacy, it's just hard to trust that. And so they, and even if they do get services in the community, online offers a different perspective, a different point of view. So I see a lot of rural and remote. I'll also see a lot of young people who are extremely, extremely busy. So that means that they're probably working, they're probably, you know, going to school, participating and taking care of their family, and they just don't have time to go to an in-person services when the in-person service is open. And even oftentimes their days are so booked that it doesn't matter how accessible your in-person service is, they just don't have time to go there without giving up something else they have to do. And so online services allow for people to do things like, and this is real things that have happened, message from work, like message when you have a lull in your office, you can pull up an app and talk to someone, get peer support online when before you would have not really had that accessible to you. We had folks online access us as baristas, as people working at the airport, as every kind of job you can imagine. And it's really great to be able to say, like, in this time in which they need help, when something stressful is happening for them right then, they can ask for a break at their job and talk to someone relatively quickly. And I think that's just a really awesome thing to offer. The last kind of person who tends to offer online support are people, for whatever reason, are pretty locked into their house, and whether it's a mental health issue and they just going outside is really hard for them right now, or a disability concern and every place is not really that accessible to them. Online services tend to really support those young people and those people asking for peer support. So how peer support online differs from in-person is that peer support in person, like peer support online and peer support in person, you're not going to meet a lot of peer supporters who can do both well or who want to do both well. The online people get really excited about the online modality. They're not going to talk to you about missing facial expressions or tones of voices. Like, they're excited to be able to see everything and respond in that way. And so my biggest point to anyone here who's looking to offer online services is not to try to make your in-person peer supporters online peer supporters. Just realize it's a different set of skills, and there are a few people who will be good at both, but I think it's really important to recruit specific people who've worked online before. The things you're looking for in that situation is you can actually read a lot in tone from writing. It forces you to do things that you think are explicit ways of showing support explicitly. Like, if someone sends you a big block of text, you'd be like, oh, can I take a few seconds? I'm just going to read through this and process it, but I'm here and I'm here with you. It gives them space to process, to respond. It also forces people, when the connection's not happening, to kind of use their words to say that, or use an action that is something that you can't really do in person. You kind of know when someone's receiving services online and they're staying with you that they really want to be there, because it's so easy to just close a window or close a chat app. It's not as socially acceptable if a peer support session is not working for you in person to just get up and leave. And so I think, to me, there's having delivered both in-person peer support and online peer support, I would say that I feel like online, the people receiving support are way more centered in the care, because they have way more power online. They kind of can just decide to leave, and there's not very much of anything you can do about it. And yeah, and most of the time too, the other thing that's really great is when people think about online services, they get really worried about risk, about someone being suicidal and you not being able to know where they are. The thing about people asking for support is that if they're showing up and they're telling you I'm suicidal, they will usually work with you and they want to get help and they want to get support. The thing they won't do is let someone force them into the kind of crisis support they don't want. So they're not going to, like, it causes you, and it's really great to do so, it causes you to be creative. Like, you know, maybe when we had someone who was suicidal, we figured out another plan for supporting them and getting them to crisis services that they need that didn't involve the cops because they didn't have a good relationship with the cops. And I think online is a really good way to kind of, that person has to work with you for you making a crisis plan for that person that makes sense with their needs. And I really love that about the online space. Yeah, just to kind of wrap up my points about this today is a lot of people will tell you that in person is more effective than online. I will tell you that you're comparing apples to oranges. People who receive services online usually don't go in person. And so you're reaching a whole new crowd of folks who don't have a huge overlap with your in-person service receivers right now. And that it's a really cool thing to be able to offer. And I really love it when places that do have brick and mortar locations offer online peer support, because then if that person builds a relationship with you online and wants to take that jump to in-person for whatever reason, they can totally do that, and it's not referring them into a whole new service where they have to tell their story all over again. And online creates a really cool record that if the young person wants it to be shared, you can share that stuff with in-person teams if they give you consent, and you kind of make that pathway make sense. And yeah, I'll just say that it's been a really cool ride. My last big advice to anyone looking into this is please do not develop technology. It is a pain in the butt. Please use something that exists out there. There's a lot of amazing technology, even if you have to customize it or change it for your situation. Like, there's a lot of amazing technology out there that does exist, and there's a lot of amazing work happening in the online peer support space. And I'm really happy to answer any questions when it's Q&A time, or if you want to find me on social media and ask me there, you can totally do that too. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Alicia, and I'm glad you made it. But yeah, again, if you have questions, don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A. So now to our final speaker, Nancy Millier, who will be talking about self-care and avoiding burnout in peer support staff. Nancy is the LC Youth Centre Supervisor and supervises 4 different projects. So Access Open Minds at LC National Aboriginal Youth Suicide Prevention Strategy, First Nation Confederacy of Cultural Education Centre's Cultural Project, and the Safe Space Dropping Programme. Nancy has been working in youth care for over 20 years, and she is a proud mother of 5 beautiful children. She loves to cook, sew, and craft. So over to Nancy.
Hi guys. I chose the topic of discussing burnout because I've seen a whole lot of it in my profession the last 20 years here. I've seen, well, I tried to count them on my hands because I haven't really kept a 20-year record, but I'm pretty sure we've gone through 28 staff or more. So for me, being able to retain staff for quite a while so that they can maintain rapport with their clients and that we won't have to retrain or re-advertise is really important to me, and the health of my staff is really important to me. So I just want to start by saying that we live in a small community, but it is heavily populated. We're over 4,500 people, and we have a lot of people come through our doors. So peer support is a little difficult at times here because a lot of times our youth are related to each other, or it's your best friend's brother, or it's somebody's cousin, or it's somebody you hung out with as a child. So the close ties in the small community can't be overlooked. It probably doesn't look the same in a city, and I wouldn't know. I haven't worked in that type of setting, but in a small town, it can get very stressful. And another thing that is super stressful for us is that our peer support styles are unique. It's not a professional setting. There's no set book on like step 1, 2, 3, this is what you do. You know, they're not doctors, they're not psychologists, but that's also the beauty of peer support as well. And another thing that can build up stress is that they are frontline. Like most of the time, they're the ones that encounter the clients when they're in the middle of their anger fit, or when they're really upset, or when parents need somebody to come blast out. It is the peer workers that take all that. It's the clinicians and the psychologists might get it too, but in our situation here, we are the first ones. We are first contact. So they get the brunt of everyone's anger and emotions, and then they move them on possibly the next day or a few days later to some clinical help. And by then, most people have calmed down. So our staff need to learn how to wipe that off, debrief, get it out of their system, that they can continue to give quality care to the rest of our clients. All the energies that are coming at them can be overwhelming. It can be very wearing on the mind. And I just want to put in here that one of my staff gave this to me. We have seen in the last year and a half that we've been intaking clients here for the Access Project. We have over 700 youth that have walked through our doors for either a quick intervention or a referral to another service, or just a quick chat on a bad day. Or sometimes they want to become a full-time client, and that's when we will log them into the system and they become a regular. We have also conducted over 1,300 brief crisis interventions since we began intake in September 2017. We've had 2 losses, 2 youth, both struck by cars, hit and run. We've had over, I think, 4 or 5 suicides as well, youth suicides. So self-care is essential for our staff to be able to do the job. And these, when I say 1,300 clients and interventions that have come in, I'm not talking like anything mild. I'm talking not a breakup with the boyfriend. This is a life or death, usually. Somebody's in crisis. So when these crises occur, it also directly affects our staff, especially if they're related somehow. So we begin every day with a smudge so that we can cleanse our worries away, whether they're personal, like get rid of your personal baggage that you've carried in with you, and we need to prep for the day with the clients. So we smudge with our sweetgrass, or we will smudge with sage, and sometimes I blend them together with the coffee grinder, and we make a nice powder of both, because it seems to be a really calming scent and a really calming smoke that comes out of it when we mix both. And again, if they have a particularly difficult client during the day, then we just come back and we smudge again, and we try to cleanse it and start over again. I found that one thing that's really important to remind my staff is to set their boundaries, and not just on day one. I don't just sit them up and say, okay, this is what you do. I have to constantly remind them, because it's so easy to get caught up in stuff. It is so easy to take things in and take them personally, and to let boundaries become gray lines when someone's your cousin or your friend, or when you get too comfortable. So I got to constantly keep reminding them about setting up their boundaries, because our clients will push those, especially if they think you're family or you're their buddy, and they want to cross those lines. So they have to keep those up in order to, just to protect themselves as well. So remind them that they're not a counselor. That's what I do. They're not a professional counselor, and they're not giving expert advice. They're giving guidance. And in order to engage in their peer support relationship with them, there has to be no power differential. Like they also can't come in and act like they're the authority figure. So I try to remind them that stay on their level, that nobody has more authority than the other. I tell them that the client should feel like they're the driver in the car, so they're in the driver's seat, and let them control their process. And your role is to listen and offer guidance that is relevant to the person you're supporting, because everybody's here for a different reason. When it's difficult at times, it's important to let your peers do things their own way, even if you don't think their way is the right way. If it's not hurting anybody, let them do it their way. Maybe that's their way of finding their peace, or their way of finding their health and their happiness. So not to be the boss, but to let them do it. Everyone's journey is different. Everyone's journey is at a different pace. A lot of my staff will get stressed out feeling like, okay, it's been a month or it's been 3 months with this client, and I haven't seen them get better, or I haven't seen them take any steps forward. And am I doing this right? Am I doing this wrong? And I just, I have to constantly remind them that it's okay. Let them, as long as they're still in contact with you, as long as you know they are safe, then you're doing your job. Like, let them do it at their own pace. It's too stressful to worry about needing to hurry up and fix things. I also have to remind them, and this is a big one, that they can't be available 24/7. Healthy relationships have clear boundaries, and I don't expect them to be available outside working hours. They're not on call, they're not getting paid to be on call, and I don't expect them to be on call. Now, if I was to call them on the weekend and say, we had a suicide last night, I need you to come in tomorrow, that's fine, but they can't be answering messages in the middle of the night. Like we've had, where somebody's in the middle, that's where they call the crisis line. That's when they call 911. If it's an immediate, I don't even think my staff should be keeping their ringers on, because I don't want them coming in the next day stressed and upset, or they've been up for 5 hours counseling somebody, because that's not what they're supposed to do. So I have to constantly remind them of that too, because they will come in overtired and stressed out and say, so-and-so messaged me at 1 a.m. and I just wanted to help them out. Well, I know you just wanted to help them out, and I know you're a helper in your heart, but at the same time, you got to keep yourself healthy as well, and you can't be doing this all the time. You have to set your boundaries. What else do I have here in my notes? We do provide we have a crisis center in our community, so we provide the crisis line number, the TMO line number, like the number for the hospital. So we do have other resources available, so not to stress themselves out or to stretch themselves too thin. And to not be a friend at that moment. You can be a friend, but there's a difference between friendly and being a friend. It's a particular challenge, but we want them to be friendly to their peer. However, when they're working with them in a work situation, it's recommended to not invite them in your social circle. If this person is your particular client now, don't go drinking with them on the weekend, even though they're your cousin or your buddy that you hung out with before, as long as they're in your care and they're a registered client of yours. It's important to keep that separate as well. I don't want them to blur the lines between work and social time, because that does lead to stress and burnout as well, in my experience. And the second main topic for them, other than setting boundaries for me, is personal care. And I have to remind them the importance of engaging in personal self-care. I promote and encourage self-care in the workplace, and I encourage them to bring that into the client's life as well. So a lot of our outreach activities that we do are based on personal care, and I encourage the staff to join in. If they're going to set up a session, I don't want them inviting 8 clients and then sitting back and watching the person they hired to come in and teach the class and not get involved. So if we had a meditation class, I want them in there as well and getting the benefits of the meditation as well. Some of the things we have done is we've done mindfulness sessions, we've had meditation sessions, we've done yoga with clients. Campfires, just sitting around a campfire is very therapeutic. It's relaxing. People seem to open up. It seems to put everybody in this nice mood, a comfortable mood where they can talk if they need to talk to the workers. So we always have a big messy pile of wood out in our youth center, and it always looks gross, like a big mess. But that's because we're actually using it. We're actually using our center. Our center isn't pristine, clean. It's not clinical looking, it's lived in. But that's what makes us us. We also have bath bomb making sessions so that they can go home and relax with their bath bombs and their milk baths. We've had nights where we teach them about what, you know, crystals do and the benefits of meditating with certain crystals. We've had outdoor hikes, so in nature hikes to waterfalls. They've gone to ice caves. We've brought them fishing, to fishing derbies and contests. Some of them enjoy that. We've had spa nights, boating and beaching days. We've had drum making sessions. We bring clients and staff get to go to sweats. We have Wednesday night sweat every week that staff are invited to go to, as well as bring clients with them. We have traditional ceremonies. We have one staff that teaches relaxation techniques. And we're big on promoting cultural activities or using cultural tools. And in our community, it's the native culture and traditions. But so the workers here, especially if they're from this community, we are aware of what we have and our resources for that. But in a city, I guess what I would do is seek out what that individual client believes is their cultural tool and their cultural tradition, because I find going back to something that reminds you of your grandparents or makes you comfortable or brings that family feeling to you is usually something that's culturally attached to yourself. So if you don't know anything about their culture, it'd probably be a good idea just to ask them, like, so what did your family do to celebrate things, or to be spiritual, or to have a gathering, like, just to find that out and bring that back to them. I find that does a whole lot for them when they bring back their roots. So it can also be useful to, like, suggest to clients who are not interested in their own culture to maybe suggest other cultural ways. Like, I'm married here. I've been living here 25 years. I'm not native, but I get big benefits from going to a sweat. I enjoy smudging, and I enjoy using the cultural tools they have here. And I don't think you necessarily have to be you don't have to be native to use native cultural and traditional tools. And I don't believe that anybody, like, probably maybe some other cultures would be interested in taking part in some of these relaxation ideas as well. And flexibility is my last one. As a supervisor, I can't stress the importance enough of being flexible with staff hours, especially with the peer workers. Some of my workers have to be here at 4 because the kids come in at 4 for the drop-in. But with my peer workers, it's like, I can get a message at 7 a.m. saying, I'm going to go to check in on client A at school this morning because I couldn't get a hold of them for 3 days, so I won't be in the office right away. And I'm like, I'm not worried about it. I am totally not. I want them to work at their pace, what makes them comfortable as well, because when your workers are stressed, they don't produce as well and leads to burnout. So when the kids aren't ready, then you're not going to be able to get anything out of them anyway. So you got to go to them when they're ready. If my staff say, tonight I got to work and I'm not coming in till noon because I can't work 12 hours, I'm like, fine, as long as you get your 6.5 in today. And if you get a little bit more, bank it for overtime, and then take it off in the morning and you can sleep in. So whatever works for you. I've worked in rigid situations where, you know, you work so many hours and you're hoping that your boss acknowledges that, right? Because you worked an extra 3 hours last night and then you didn't come in at 9 and she's flipping out and you're like, I'm exhausted. I was working like from 8 till 8 last night and I need time. And I'm that type of supervisor now that realizes that as long as the work gets done, as long as they put in the hours they're getting paid for, I don't care where they put them. And as long as they're balancing, so to make sure that they're not overworking as well. I allow for last minute debriefs so they can drop in any time in my office unless I'm doing something like this where my door is closed and I'm busy, but I try to make myself available as much as I can, because when they want to let stuff off their chest, they need it at that moment. It's that if they have pent up stress for 4 days and I don't have time to debrief with them, they gunny sack it. And then, 4 days later, it's sitting in their bag of stress. They're not ready to talk about it. It is back there. They already packed it back there. So now it's just adding to everything. So I think it's really important to let them debrief when they need it. or offer them like if they want to go to a clinical session, which we're lucky because we have a mental health center down the road, they can go anytime. Like if they say this morning, I need to go talk to so-and-so, the clinician, then I let them go. So being very flexible is important as well as a supervisor to avoid staff burnout. And that's it for my notes. I don't know if I hit the 8 minutes or.
Thanks so much, Nancy. You did perfect on time.
Okay.
So that's it for our speaker presentations. We'll now go into our panel discussion about challenges to do with peer support. So to make sure that we're being the most interactive, but also the most relevant to the people who are on this talk, I'm going to launch a poll where our speakers have come up with challenges that they would like to speak to, but we would like to know what you would like us to speak about. So please vote now. So yeah, the poll should be up on the screen. So if you could choose your top 3 of the challenges you would like us to cover today. Okay, so I'm sharing the results now. So it looks like most of you wanted to hear about integrating peer support into clinical teams, organizations, and the continuum of mental health services. Then the second highest is creating an environment that is supportive of peer support. Burnout, confidentiality, whether it be with the clinical team or family, and then lastly, retaining peer support staff. Right, so I guess I'll open the floor as such to the speakers, and we'll start with the challenges of integrating peer support into clinical teams, organizations, and the continuum of mental health services. If anyone can speak to that.
Well, I think you're always going to face, you know, time, money, you know, barriers of time, barriers of money, barriers of, you know, you have 10 minutes to get through this interaction. It's not, as Lee said in their talk, that it is not necessarily they're considered experts. And so why would we include that? So that knowledge of we can benefit from the experience of others isn't necessarily easily incorporated into clinical practice.
Yeah, I think there's also this challenge with integrating peer support into especially clinical practices where there is kind of this idea that it's like it's a step down in like a stepped care model, that, you know, peer support is a great thing to provide while people are waiting to get the real services. And I think in a lot of ways, organizations are looking to hire peer support workers as a bit of a band-aid for a bigger problem when they're trying to hire them as kind of, you know, an in-between, like a sub-clinician in some ways, where, you know, maybe it's someone who we think we can pay less. I think that's a big part of it. Like, oh, well, we don't want to hire another social worker, so we'll hire a peer support worker because we can pay them less. And then I think we end up in these weird situations where, you know, these clinical systems have this idea of this is what a peer support worker can and will provide. And then the peer support worker might come in and be like, this is entirely like antithetical to what I believe as a peer support worker or what is reasonable. And then it gets, you know, written off as a failure of peer support as opposed to like an inappropriate integration of that service.
Does anyone want to?
Oh,
Go ahead.
it's Alicia. I just really wanted to pick up a couple points that we made. So there's actually now one of the things that I think is really awesome that Foundry is doing is that they have changed their step care model to include peer support at every step. We're actually going to IAYMH in Australia to talk about that. And I think it's really important for people to understand and create systems that understand that there are peer supporters can handle, I mean, you have to, with everyone, they have to be trained properly to do this. But peer supporters can handle a great deal of risk. They can handle a great deal of complication and confusion and trauma. They just have to be supported well to do that. And part of that is compensation. Part of that's a work environment that has them in, that respects them when making decisions and includes them and co-designs things with them, as well as, you know, obviously the end users. And so I think part of a reason why sometimes these issues fail is that people are not really willing to do the change management process they need to do to change their systems to make it possible for a peer supporter to succeed. And I think it's quite a shame because while really, really good peer support and really, really good counseling could look similar, they do offer people very different things. And I think they're really good complements to each other, but I don't really think the idea that that they can replace other services or that they're like the holder service while you wait for the other one is like a healthy way to see it. I think peer support has to be a good standalone field in and of itself. And I've seen a lot of peer supporters do really amazing work that just from the restrictions of colleges and things like that, more traditional health professionals would not be able to do.
Great, thank you. Do Nancy or Gina want to contribute to this question, or?
I just want to add, and I'm not a super professional in the field of clinicians, but in my experience, most of our youth do not even open up with their clinician as much as they do with the peer worker. There has to be that connection where even if maybe the peer worker goes in with them to see the psychologist, I don't know. I don't know the answer. I just know that the clinicians, the psychologists, the stuffy people in suits and in their clinical offices aren't getting half the information they should be getting from the clients because they don't feel comfortable enough to share it. And how can you help somebody heal if they can't even open up to you? And it doesn't even have to do with the personality. It has to do with the situation, the four walls and the clinical room. My staff get more out of the youth on a car ride to the ice cream store than the clinician can get in a full month of sessions. And that's all I have to add. I don't have any answer to it, but we're doing something wrong when they can't even open up in a clinical situation.
And I think I just wanted to add that I think that Nancy, I think it was, made a really good point there. And I think that's why it's really important to ensure that when you're doing coaching, that, Foundry Centers open with coaching. I think a lot of Access Open Mind Centers open similarly. That you include your peer support team in those case management things, because they see people from a different perspective, and it helps the young people, with the young people's permission, of course, but it helps the young person have like a stronger team there. And so often the peer support staff and And even sometimes, like, even your front desk staff can know a lot of different things about a young person. So I think having really wholesome and inclusive case management and coaching and that kind of stuff is really important, and not just limiting it to who traditionally goes to those things.
Thank you. So now I think, Gina, you had a point.
I don't, I think there's already a lot of really great points that have been made, and I don't know that I have anything necessarily new to add, except to say that I think that the burden of change needs to be placed on organizations. And I think for me, one of the biggest challenges is that there's such tensions between, I think, the philosophies or frameworks that guide the work that peer support workers do, kind of the key principles and tenets of peer support, and then often the dominant models that really influence the delivery of services in traditional mental health settings. So I think if I think about the challenges of integrating peer support workers, it's really about how to perhaps have discussions about these different ways of knowing, different ways of working with people. And I think there's something to be said about having cohesive teams that could also, if you've got an unhealthy team with dynamics that may be difficult, and whether you're a peer support worker or a service provider, adding somebody new to a team that may not be functioning very well can really just be problematic all around. So I think there's lots of factors and lots of issues that need to be looked at that have to do with just philosophy, structure of organizations, and teamwork, and how we need to have, and finally, I want to say that the importance of also addressing stigma, because I think there's, we can't, in order for a peer support worker to feel like they're an equal and valuable member of a team, then we need to be able to really acknowledge that it isn't an us and them situation, that there are people who are service providers who have their own mental health issues, and that if there is a space for people to talk openly rather than it being seen as that only the peer support workers have lived experience, I think that would be one step forward to better integration of peer support workers as well.
Thank you. So a lot of solutions there. Just before we go on to the second challenge, I see that we still don't have any questions from the audience. So this is your time, because we'll soon be going to the Q&A session. I think we should maybe go to confidentiality. Well, if we have time, we'll come back to burnout, because I know burnout was mentioned by Nancy. And I know we haven't really touched upon confidentiality at all today, so I will open up the floor to that. So whether it be with the clinical team that peer support workers are working with, or family and carers. Yeah, Karen. There we go. Sorry.
There, I think I'm unmuted. So just a word about the family and carers is we're in a bit of a different situation, because it's not direct treatment. We are supporting those that are seeking treatment with the clinical team. And so often we look at mental health treatment as, the formal way of what society sees as formal healthcare treatment, which is through counselors, psychologists, clinicians, psychiatrists, medication, hospitalization. And so often we see that, but what we neglect is the other supports that are in a person's life. And so really that person, if you look at them as the center, and then you look at all the other supports that are around them, the formal medical treatment is only a small part of that. And so now it's how do we bring out that support that is around the individual? How do we wrap all those resources around them so they get more holistic support? And so one of the ways that our Access Open Minds Edmonton, for example, what they're doing is they are supporting families. They are supporting those families who have youth with mental health issues, whether they're actually in that situation, or whether the youth are actually accessing that service or not. And so in that way, it doesn't really matter. Confidentiality isn't an issue, because we are teaching mentoring, coaching, supporting families to help their youth. We are educating, we are providing resources that they can access so that they can build their own capacity. And that's where it's important. So often we see in families who are supporting youth with mental health is the clinicians will just say, we can't tell you anything because the youth said they don't want the family involved, or because of confidentiality, or because of whatever barrier. And that immediately puts that wedge in between the youth and their support system. So it's just, I think for us, confidentiality and information sharing there's lots of ways that you can support that support system without breaching that confidentiality. And it's knowing what are the laws and policies that actually apply, and how can we work around them so we're not breaching anything.
Thanks, Karen. Did anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah, I think just understanding a little bit about, I think Karen brought up a really good point about being aware of like the laws and the policies, because I think a lot of people aren't, and including like medical professionals, because it's kind of like, oh, I was told this by this person and like that seems right to me. And one of the things that like I've kind of learned over the past couple months is this idea of like there can be a lot of nuance with confidentiality. It doesn't have to be like with a young person. It doesn't have to be, do you want us to tell your family about this or do you not? Or with a peer support worker, do you want us to tell the clinician about this or not? It can, like, I mean, obviously in various contexts, they might have their own confidentiality rules, but it can be, you know, if it's about sharing information with family, can I tell them this specific piece of information? Maybe not. Okay, can we tell them this specific piece of information? And it takes time to work out that nuance. But I think that that's time worth taking. And then also, of course, it's tied in with these conversations around like, I know as like, you know, someone who sits on these projects and a lot of the time on the youth council, and we see these family councils saying like, oh, we really want to be like involved. We want like there to be different confidentiality rules for family and that sort of thing. And I'm always so jealous of the youth who those are the family members of, because like, I think we do miss a big picture when we realize that like a lot of the youth have family members who like, it's really important that they aren't involved in this information. Right. And so just kind of understanding that like people come from very different contexts as well.
I can add a little bit to that as well. I mentioned earlier that I've been overseeing a study focused on the role of family peer support in the context of the emergency department, and we've been consulting with youth and family advisory councils. And one of the important points that the youth have raised with us around confidentiality is that it's absolutely critical to be clear about the limits of confidentiality the moment you meet with the youth, because they may be in a situation where they don't know, and as Lee said, sometimes providers don't know themselves, but it's so important to be really transparent about the limits of confidentiality, so that if a youth can then make an informed decision about what they share or don't share, and if there is potentially, you know, abuse or something happening within their home that could potentially then lead to disclosures to child protection services, that they knew outright that would happen, because that's the worst betrayal when you share something and then you're told that it's no longer confidential. So knowing from the outset. So I think whether you're a peer or family peer support worker or service provider, being really clear about, you know, our legal and obligations to report certain information that gets shared with us is really important to maintain that relationship and that trust with the young people and their families.
Agree as well with you, Gina. Like in my years of experience, I've really been upfront with the youth and let them know that like, I'm here to help you. I'm here to support you. I'm not leaking any of your secrets, but if you let me know certain things, I have limits on what I'm allowed to keep as a secret and not legally. And I've actually had 2 clients come back to me in the last few years and say, they're like in their 20s now, and say, well, way back when I was having a hard time and you were helping me out, you know, I just wanted to thank you. You did so much for me at that time. I was being sexually abused, but I didn't want to tell you because I knew you'd have to report it. And I didn't want to be removed from my home. I didn't want to go to court and charge anybody. I just wanted somebody there so I could like let it off my chest and relieve myself. So now I'm telling you, they've come back because you don't have a legal obligation to report it now.
Thank you. I know Alicia had to leave the call. We have time, I think, for maybe one more challenge. And I think that would be creating an environment that is supportive of peer support workers. And maybe we can link in burnout into that. So how do you create an environment that's also supporting them in the sense that they don't then go into burnout? So again, I'll open it to our speakers.
I think, and I was writing about this with regards to youth engagement as well a couple weeks ago. I think it is tied in with this idea of peer support becoming more mainstream and more appealing in a lot of ways. I think organizations, whether that's a clinical team, whether that's a school or a university or whatever, I think organizations really, really, really need to think about why they're doing this and what they are willing to do in order to support a peer support worker. Because I think a lot of the times organizations will paint this picture of, you know, we want to see whether it's youth engagement or peer support or whatever, and kind of be, and I don't think intentionally dishonest, but I think they kind of paint this picture of what they would love to be without being realistic about like where their boundaries are. And so if it is like, you know, kind of the difference between like, oh, like it's maybe peer informed, or we want to hire peers to do this, but we already very much have laid out what we want you to do, or that sort of thing. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I think when organizations say like, we want to do peer support because the like peer-to-peer relationships are so important and we really value peer support, and then peer support workers get there and that's not the case because of other institutional guidelines or other requirements or other whatever it is, I think that's where a lot of peer support workers get burned out in a lot of ways. And in it, I think it's in that difference between like, this is what we say we want you to do, and this is kind of what our actual practice has to be. And so I think in hiring peer support workers or in putting in a peer support program, being really mindful about like, yes, maybe this is what we want to do, but what are we realistically doing right now? And usually there's not a problem with that. Like it's okay to be like, this is our baby step towards having a full peer support program. But in the meantime, this is kind of what we're able to do within the confines of our organization.
Thanks, Lee. Nancy?
I'm jumping in.
Yeah.
One thing also that was really, really good, Lee. There was something I didn't think of mentioning as well. Another thing that kind of triggered me when you said that was overloading plates. When a peer worker is really good at a specific something, we tend to give them more of that. And that happens to me actually, and I'm not a peer worker anymore, but if you're good at writing proposals, more are coming your way. And if you're good at organizing an event, more are coming your way. And we have to realize that we're only human and we can only put so much on our plate before we're overfull. And I myself have stepped in between upper management and the peer support workers and actually put my foot down and said no before it even gets to them. I'm like, no, they're tired. No, they've seen like 40 clients this week. No, I know they're good at it, but find somebody else. No, I know you want to save money, but no. So you have to be an advocate for your peer workers as well. Like, I take my job seriously as a support to them, and their health is important to me, just as important as the client's health.
Thanks, Nancy. Karen or Gina? Karen?
There, okay. And I think another thing that Lee touched on was the idea of hierarchy, and that the circle of care, you know, you are always, you're looking at the medical professionals as the apex. You know, they are accountable to certain policies, accreditation bodies that peer support workers aren't necessarily accountable to. And so in that way, it becomes that sort of friction between hierarchies, and there is a power differential there, just the way that the systems are laid out. And I think being very mindful that we are just a part of we are part of that continuity of care, that it isn't the clinician or the counselor or the psychologist who is at the center of that circle of care. It is the client who's at the center of the circle of care, and being really mindful that everybody is a part of that, and that we are, and it is inclusive, not oppressive.
Thanks, Karen. Gina, anything to add before we go on to Q&A?
Chloe, I don't know that I have much more to add. It's terrible going last because all the great points have been made. But I just want to echo, I think, what I've heard, which is I think having the client and their family of choice be at the center of the circle of care, and that sometimes whoever your family of choice is or your friends can change. So it's not decisions that are made at one time point, that it's always important to kind of continue to engage and kind of think about who's in that center. And the only other thing I would add is having really good leadership and allies that continuously kind of keep an eye on where things are not working well is really critical. So that's all I would add to what's already been said.
Thank you. And I'm conscious it's been a long webinar, so and you've done a lot of talking. Thank you so much. Obviously, we didn't cover all of the challenges. That goes to show that maybe there'll be a second part to this webinar. Still no questions. I don't know if it's because this system isn't working or not everyone's able to access it if you're on your phone, for example. But I'll wait maybe a minute to let the audience add any questions if they want to. If not, you can always contact me. You'll get an email after this webinar with my email with questions that you have either for the whole team or just a speaker specifically, and then I can transfer it to them. So I still don't see any questions coming in, so I'm assuming that's because people don't have any, or they prefer to do it at a later time point. So I guess this is wrapping up. I want to start off by thanking all of our speakers. This webinar wouldn't have happened without you, and it was just so nice to have such diverse speakers from different areas of Canada, but also different expertise, and I think it was excellent to have all of that knowledge put together in one place. As I said, don't hesitate to send me an email if you have any questions. You'll be receiving a survey tomorrow, and I'd really appreciate if you could fill it out, because it helps us evaluate what we're doing and also make sure that the ones that we do in the future fit what the audience wants. Last poll, for those who are still on the line, thank you for sticking with us. It's just asking you what kind of subjects you'd like to see covered in future webinars. But again, you can always send an email and it will be in the survey, but I thought I'd put it out there now. Thank you very much to Geraldine, who's been translating for the last hour and a half. The webinar will be, I'm very impressed. The webinar will also be available online later on this month. So if you want to watch it again or share it with your networks, that will be possible. So I'll wait another 20 seconds for the webinar, for the poll. Well, I think that's it, apart from that. Okay. So it looks like most of you want to hear about youth engagement. So we will obviously have a youth council, and there are youth at each of our sites. So great to hear that that's something that you want to learn more about. So that's it. Thank you very much for attending and those who are still on the line. And again, a huge thank you to our speakers for taking the time to share their knowledge with us today.